that, everyone?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So good morning and welcome to the Roadmap to Mill Redevelopment, a 4-part webinar series. I'm Colette Santasiri. I'm the Executive Director of the New Jersey Institute of Technology's Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities Program, also known as NJIT TAB. Today, NJIT and EPA Region 1 are presenting the first webinar in the series, New England Mills Then and Now, a look back at the importance of mills in New England's history and a look forward to their new prominence. Next slide. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. All participants will be muted during the webinar. At any time during this webinar, if you have any questions at all, please type them into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom right on your screen, and make sure that it's to the setting of all so that we all see your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the NJIT TAB site, website, which is www.njit.edu/tab. Look under the resources section, and we'll have that posted in a few days. Next slide. So today's program features 3 terrific speakers: Dennis of EPA Region 1, Rachel Robinson, and Kathleen Dorgan, and more about our speakers in a few minutes. Next slide. So as mentioned, this webinar is being brought to you by the NJIT TAB program and EPA Region 1. The NJIT TAB program, with funding from EPA, provides free technical assistance to state, regional, county, tribal, and local government entities and nonprofits who want to transform brownfield sites into community assets. For more information, please contact NJIT TAB via email at tab@njit.edu or call us at 973-642-4165, and we can tell you how we can provide you with free assistance. And please visit our website. Next slide, please. Now to hear more about the great work that EPA is doing, it is my honor to introduce Dennis Diesel, Administrator of EPA Region 1. Dennis is a New Hampshire native who has spent much of his life working in the nation's capital and joined EPA having worked for over 20 years on energy, environment, and homeland security matters in the federal government. He most recently worked at Dow as the Director of Federal Government Affairs, where he focused on environment, energy, and regulatory affairs issues. Prior to entering the private sector, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Environmental Management at the U.S. Department of Energy from 2012 to 2014, where he led budget, policy, and planning development for the nation's largest environmental cleanup program. He also managed chemical security issues at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security from 2004 to 2010, and prior to that, he served as a policy advisor for the Council for Environmental Quality from 2002 to 2004. Dennis began his career working at EPA in the pesticides and the chemicals program. Dennis, welcome.
Thanks very much, Colette, for the welcome. I hope you can see and hear me. And thanks to the New Jersey Institute of Technology, the other speakers, and my colleagues at EPA for making this webinar series possible. Before I turn it over to today's speakers, I'd like to quickly provide some of the backstory behind this webinar series and put a spotlight on the effort EPA and our community partners are putting into this historic mill redevelopment effort. First, though, from my family and everyone at EPA, I want to wish everyone well in these uncertain times. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy while we are all facing unprecedented operational, personal, professional challenges. I know it can be difficult to turn to our webcams and dial into a work call. I do find some solace and hope you do as well in our day-to-day job at EPA. More importantly, the revitalization and restoration work we'll talk about today and over the next few webinars is vital for the long and short-term sustainability of our communities. As Colette mentioned, I grew up in New Hampshire and I've got family from sort of every corner of New England, and I'm acutely aware of how important your work on historic sites, community redevelopment, building repurposing, and job creation is for the region. Thank you all for your efforts. The work we'll be talking about today is also personally important to me. Back in the 1860s, 1870s, both sides of my family moved to New England to work in the textile mills from Amoskeag Mills in Manchester and the mills of New Bedford, Massachusetts, and the mills in Manville, Rhode Island. Many of my family stories and family lore I heard growing up involve specifically Amoskeag Mills. Both my grandfathers on my mother's side and my father's side started working at Amoskeag in the 1910s when they were really just children, which is, I think, how it worked back then. And that's where their brothers and sisters worked and their parents. And so sort of part of my family history is the mill story. And I know that this same story, this family legacy is repeated so often across New England towns. The mill story is familiar with anyone from New England. The mills are really an iconic symbol, I think, of the New England region. Again, a mill in every town, on almost every river, a symbol of an industrious nation, pushing for progress. And I think an important part of our past, an important part of our future as well. As the birthplace of our nation's industrial revolution, New England is left, of course, with more than its fair share of legacy sites and contaminated properties. To address this challenge, EPA Region 1, alongside local business and civic leadership, is committed to seeing old mills, former tanneries, and other such properties repurposed into the industries and commercial hubs of the next generation. Remediating just one building can have a resounding impact on the community around it. New jobs, new housing, access to food, all made possible by people coming together to revitalize their neighborhoods. And we're here to be as helpful in that process as possible. These industrial sites and the communities that they helped grow shaped generations of my family's history, and I'm proud to now be in a position to return the favor. Whether through brownfield grants, with technical assistance funds, part of an opportunity zone engagement and tax incentive programs, or through a number of other regional and national programs, EPA is committed to finding innovative ways to support this work and these communities. Since taking the RA position, I have toured a number of mills this year in various phases of brownfields assessments, cleanup, and redevelopment, and have been inspired by the local champions who lead the charge with vision, resourcefulness, creativity, and grit. Along those lines, a quick public service announcement to pass along. The fiscal year 2021 Brownfields Grant competition is currently underway, and applications are due at the end of October 28th, via grants.gov. Projects that deal with mill revitalization can make for competitive applications, and this year's guidelines include language about opportunity zones and reuse of existing structures. To all of you who may be applying this year, we wish you the best of luck. With that, again, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to this conversation. Thanks also to Colette and her whole team at the New Jersey IT, the Technical Assistance to Brownfields Program for producing and organizing this webinar series. So important. Thank you for your work. It's a great example of the type of technical assistance needed to help our grantees drive success in Region 1 communities. I will now turn it back over to Colette to introduce our esteemed panelists. Colette, back to you.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you so much for your remarks and for sharing your family history regarding New England Mills. I learned something new. I didn't know you had that connection, so that was great. And thanks so much from NJIT to EPA for the great partnership we have. So as mentioned, the Roadmap to Mill Redevelopment is a 4-part series. All of the webinar series speakers work in New England, and all of the examples of redeveloped mills in this series are from New England states. If you want to register for any of these webinars, please visit the NJIT website for registration information. Next slide. Our next presentation is a glimpse at the history of New England's iconic mills given by Rachel Robinson. In 2017, Rachel joined the Providence Preservation Society as its Director of Preservation. She's the former Executive Director of the Bucharest Mission Foundation and the Felicity Redevelopment Incorporated, both located in New Orleans. Rachel holds a master's degree in urban and environmental planning and a certificate in historic preservation from the University of Virginia and a master's degree in historical and sustainable architecture from New York University, London. She serves on the board of West Broadway Neighborhood Association and New England Chapter Society of Architectural Historians and is a member of the Providence Community Library Facilities Committee. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you very much. I hope the sound's okay in the video. Thank you, Colette, for that introduction and for inviting me to participate. Good morning, everyone. I've been asked to provide an introduction to New England Mills and will attempt in this brief talk. This is a dense and far-reaching topic, and we will only scratch the surface today, but I hope after this primer, you will be able to recognize and better appreciate the lasting legacy of the American Industrial Revolution and the mills that made it possible, which are still visible throughout the cultural landscape of New England. Next slide. Not to sound like a high school valedictorian, which I was not, but I think because we come from different areas and backgrounds, it's important to start with a basic definition of mill. Here, I've pulled examples that pertain specifically to a building application. The first definition appropriately takes us to the origin of the word with the grinding of grain into flour and describes the housing of machinery used for processing. The second definition pertains to machinery for manufacturing and provides the examples of paper and steel mills. It's noteworthy that neither of these mention the elemental feature of water power or proximity to a water source, nor do they specify textile mills, which are the first and I would guess most common examples of mills. Next slide. It's always nice to have an excuse to dive into a subject, and when I began preparation for the talk, my executive director pointed me to this book in our office library. It was done in the mid-1970s by a New England photographer who grew up in a mill town in the Hudson River Valley. This timing is notable and usually the point at which I stress that due to our nation's bicentennial and a rise in social history, particularly women's history in the 1970s, we see fervent scholarship and documentation in this time period to capture stories from the early days of our republic and writing that is more inclusive. Here we see on the cover a woman mill worker, as women and child laborers are central to this story. The author placed equal emphasis on the mill buildings and the people who inhabited them. Next slide. I've taken the table of contents from the first half of the book to give us a general timeline of the rise and fall of the American Industrial Revolution, for those of you who like to have dates for context. In just a moment, I'll introduce you to the place where it really got started. But for now, we can note the 18th century genesis, the 19th century peak, and the 20th century decline. Though there was a brief uptick during World War II production, there are several factors in the long decline of mill activity, including cheaper labor in the South, further mechanization and computerization of production, and the migration of jobs overseas. Next slide. And now for the origin story. While you might be able to detect that I am not a native New Englander, as a resident Rhode Islander, I have to note that our bigger brother to the north, Massachusetts, has really stolen our Revolutionary thunder. And by that, I mean both American Revolutionary War and American Industrial Revolution history. So please allow me to introduce this often overlooked and underappreciated site just north of Providence. This is Slater Mill, which is the cradle of the American Industrial Revolution by means of water-powered textile technology. In a nutshell, a young Samuel Slater came over to the US from England in 1793 with memorized knowledge of the mechanization of cotton textile production, means to harness the necessary water power, and also methods for attracting and controlling the workforce. This earned him the nickname in Great Britain of Slater the Trader. Nonetheless, he teamed up with wealthy Providence industrialist Moses Brown, and they went on to build this mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, thus setting off the US Industrial Revolution. Now, there are many firsts associated with this site, which is today part of the Blackstone River Valley National Park and a site you can visit under normal circumstances. Slater's wife, Hannah, was no slouch. She is arguably the first woman in America to receive a US patent for her invention, a new method of producing cotton thread for sewing. You might be surprised to learn that children were the first employees at this mill. The work was dangerous and the hours were long. They could expect to work 12 hours a day in the winter and 16-hour days in the summer, and that's 6 days a week. On the 7th day, they did not rest. They were sent to Sunday school so that they would stay out of trouble and under the eyes of their Protestant employers. As technologies progressed and machines became even more dangerous, the next cheapest source of labor was recruited, that of young women. When they were asked to work longer hours for 25% less pay in the early 19th century, this became the site of the first labor strike in America. Slater Mill also happens to be the very first property listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which began in 1966. While this image is quite serene and idyllic today, despite its location wedged between I-95 and downtown Pawtucket, we must remember the near constant noise and smells and humidity and lint flying around that the workers had to cope with. We should also consider the greater context in which mills played a central role from their earliest days. These issues include child labor, labor laws and unions, environmental consequences, and the fact that the cotton processed in New England textile mills was the product of enslaved labor in the American South until the Civil War. Next slide. It's dizzying to think about how many mills were active in New England in the 19th century, because I know that we have lost so many to fire and flood and neglect, and yet so many remain, either idle or happily adaptively reused. Now, there are countless examples of mills I could share, but I will stick close to home in Providence. I wanted to share this image because I love how it shows a mill complex chock-a-block full of buildings and lets us imagine the organic expansion of these largely self-contained complexes. This is the American Woolen Company site in the Olneyville neighborhood on the west side of Providence. Typically, a mill complex, One moment. Typically, a mill complex starts with a long central building of many stories to house the equipment and situated next to the water source. This building can be added onto and duplicated as the mill prospered and additional production was added. You'll find smaller buildings on the road that were used for administrative offices. You can also expect that in the far right of this picture, we are glimpsing a worker's cottage, which were often built by the mill owner to keep everyone happy, healthy, and close by. Other buildings you can expect to see nearby a mill site are schools, libraries, community halls, company stores, so that money earned on the site could be spent on site, and the all-important church and its mandatory Sunday school. Next slide. Sadly, this mill complex does not survive. Being aware of mill landscape, we can find clues in this Google Earth image. We can see the water, a clearing on the waterside property, proximity to another mill, in this case, Atlantic Mills to the left survives, and what we can imagine to be former workers' cottages across the street. Next slide. While the office building was lost only 20 years ago to fire, today the site is being used as a community garden, playground, public park, and greenway. And I think it features a fitting tribute to the former mill in the form of this monument made out of the granite signage and, oddly enough, the cannonball safe that survives. Next slide. Knowing that there are many vulnerable surviving mill buildings, we at the Providence Preservation Society try to do our bit by calling attention to them and hopefully inspiring adaptive reuse. These are just a few of the examples from lists of past most endangered properties, an annual program that takes nominations from the public to highlight properties susceptible to demolition or neglect. The top right is the Atlantic Mills from the previous slide, and the bottom right is currently being turned into residences. And we'll see the bottom left in just a moment. Next slide. This is the inside of the Earnscliffe Woolen Mill today, which is also located in Olneyville. We had a site visit a couple years ago. Next slide. In preparation for a spring program called Sites and Stories Explored, where we teamed artists and scholars to interpret some of our most endangered properties from the 2018 list. Next slide. And the result here was an amazing choral and spoken word performance called She Died for Our Convenience. This interactive event drew more than 500 people and called attention to the anonymous and forgotten women who worked in the mill. I invite you to look at the artist's website at the bottom for more pictures and video from this event. Next slide. And finally, here's one more mill building in Olneyville in Providence, awaiting second life. I wanted to share this image with you because I think it captures the history, opportunity, and beauty of the many mill buildings in the New England landscape. With some environmental remediation and creative design, the embodied energy and materials in these buildings provide massive square footage for adaptive reuse. Next slide. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions a bit later.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Rachel gave us a glimpse back in time, and now we're going to focus on the new life being breathed into these relics, relics of New England's history, relics of New England's industry. While some mills have been demolished, in every New England state, there are mills that have been repurposed for a variety of new uses, including housing, senior and community services, small businesses, job training, and event spaces. Throughout this webinar series, you will learn more about the transformation of some of the mills you see on this slide, as well as others that are serving a new generation of uses and users. Next slide. An important step in the roadmap to mill redevelopment is engaging the community. What does the community need? What does the community want? And how can the public space around mills be activated? Our next presentation, given by Kathleen Dorgan, focuses on community and place-driven design in the Woonsocket Mill Race District in Rhode Island. Kathleen Dorgan, principal of Dorgan Architecture and Planning of Storrs, Connecticut, specializes in sustainable, participatory community design and development for communities of choice and justice. Her work includes arts and place-based planning, design of high-performance housing, Main Street revitalization, structuring green initiatives, resilience, and technical assistance to nonprofit organizations and public agencies. Her projects have been exhibited in the National Building Museum and museums and galleries throughout the nation. She received a Harvard Loeb Fellowship and is a past chair of the AIA Housing Knowledge Community, the Association for Community Design, and the AIA Housing and HUD secretaries, awards, juries. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Colette, and Dennis and Rachel, thank you for that incredibly great information leading into this presentation. Mills are such fantastic places. There's already placemaking that's incurred over the history of those facilities. And so there's some people who wonder, well, why do we need to start with the community design process when we've already got such great places? And I would answer that because, as Rachel let us know, things have changed, right? We're not using these for the same thing. So we really have to re-envision their use in the communities that they are and the way that they connect to those communities. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit more about my firm and the work that we do. Can we advance the slide? And it's really about, as Colette introduced, really envisioning the future and how in the design and physical changes we can make, we do the most for the real importance of communities, which is where they are as places for people to live and work. On the next slide, you'll see that the real key to this story is the client here, who is the not-for-profit developer of the Millrace District. NeighborWorks Blackstone River Valley is an amazing organization. You can see above here on this slide, they've already done 1 mill renovation for affordable housing. They've rehabilitated buildings in the neighborhood, and they're an incredible working team. And Joe, Paula, Christian, Meg, Antonio, and Ainsley, Margot, and so many more people contributed to the work you're going to see here, and so much more that's going on in this amazing project and all of their amazing work over time. I think it's important to note that they have relationships with the neighborhood that are vital to the kind of participatory work that we're doing, and that ranges from working with the First Nations in the area to the newest immigrants. And in the course of the work that you'll see, they provided programs and interpretation in more than 7 languages. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit about the overall site. On the map that's here, the light colored buildings are 3 mill buildings and 1 former hardware store that NeighborWorks was able to acquire. This is an important set of buildings, both because it anchors the downtown Main Street that you see going north from there up, and makes a connection to the Blackstone, as Rachel pointed out. That's such an important part of the potential of mills and how they work. It's also adjacent to a underused public park. And so that when we looked at this project, we certainly were looking at the buildings themselves, but as important, and maybe even more important, is looking at the connections to the community. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit more. That overgrown area between the fences is the actual mill race where the water came through the site, and is key to the working of the mills when they were working mills, but also to the conceptual both branding of the project, of the work that NeighborWorks did, but also our thinking about the plan for the site. And you can see the variety of the mills surrounding that site. On the next slide, you'll see that we really connected the planning for the mill race to long-term set of planning done in the neighborhood. And I had the pleasure of working with NeighborWorks previously on looking at the broader neighborhood, the broader area, and its connection to the main street. And we had a lot of fun with this, as well as a lot of serious work in getting information about community members, what they wanted, what they needed. You can see on the top here some voting using beans and cans about visual preferences. On the upper right, you can see we actually built some little test furniture and things to see how we could connect to the community. And as always, you know, meeting and eating is a good part of the community engagement process. On the next slide, you'll also see that we worked with community leaders in this early process. And this is a trip we took to Boston to really look at what other people have done. There's so much to learn from the community, to learn from the history, as Rachel shared with us, but there's a lot to learn from the work that other people have done and to build connections with them. On the next slide, you'll see that one of the things we did is map the neighborhood and the assets there, both as an opportunity to highlight those in future planning, but also not to compete with things in a limited market. And on the next slide, you'll see that we went from that mapping of assets and along with the mapping of the physical assets, there was a process of mapping the incredible assets of the members of the community. So many brilliant people doing brilliant things that were not visible. And we came up with, a plan of what are the things we're going to concentrate on going forward. On the next slide, you'll see that overall planning then informed the visioning for the Millrace district. And we really continue to do a lot of engaged activities, you'll see on the right, to try both to ask people their opinions, but also to test different things. What works here? What connects things? How do we make that happen in a way that makes this place more active going forward and a larger asset for a community that needs to strengthen its downtown and support the businesses that are very important in that area. On the next slide, you'll see that we, at the same time, looked for what have other people done in similar locations, how have they used scrap material, low-cost materials to make engaging, unique areas that people want to go and to see. On the following slide, you'll see that we, of course, did not ignore the history. Great preservationists look at the buildings and the history of those buildings, and we brought that information into our planning. And we looked at not only the history of the individual properties and what had happened and how much had been lost in the community, but also the context of what was the community like when they were built. You see in the density in the 1930s, and that by 2005, and certainly by the time we were working, so much of that texture had been lost, and making connections through some of the vacant areas, and both working with vacant buildings, but also parking lots is part of the challenge to this project. On the next slide, you'll see that one of the great privileges of working on this project was the ability to collaborate with programming that NeighborWorks is doing. So NeighborWorks is really looking at using the spaces that were already existing, but thinking about future of the space and what kind of programming would meet the needs of Woonsocket, the needs of the diverse community, and the goals of making a viable both commercial and residential space in the future. On the next slide, you'll see we were able to take advantage of those events and really incorporate a lot of our community process in the events, rather than holding meetings that are hard to get people to turn out for and tend to only include certain categories of people. By using different events and different kinds of events targeted to different folks, we were able to incorporate a much broader group of the community, including young people and folks from different ethnicities, and able to communicate individually in a variety of languages that wouldn't have been possible in a fixed setting in the same way. On the next slide, you'll see that we took advantage of those meetings to start really, and events to really start mapping where did people go, what space was being used, what space wasn't being used. And you'll see on this the incubator building, where there's now an incubator test kitchen, the former hardware, that there were ways to get the upper plaza where you see lots of dots in the primary drawing used, but the lower plaza wasn't well used. So targets of our planning became, how do we make that better used, and how do we make a better connection, which would be to the lower right, to the park area. And you'll see more discussion of that later in this presentation. On the next slide, you see that we really looked at what was important of the existing community to folks. So we didn't only ask what they wanted to see in the future, which we of course did and looked at the program, but we tried to understand what was important to people now on the site so that we made sure that that was preserved. And we had a wonderful partner in that, is in the Museum of Work and Culture that's embedded in this site, has been part of the planning and programming all along the way. Incredible resource. So we came up with concepts about, you know, what we really wanted to accomplish going forward. And part of our thinking about that was that not only the activities that would be embedded in that, but how the activities that would stimulate the greater community area, and how art could be part of that. On the next slide, you'll see we also thought carefully about the adjacent park, the uses in that park, and how those might connect to the uses on NeighborWorks site, how circulation might enhance that. And along with that, on the next slide, you'll see that we really looked at the spaces between the buildings and had the privilege to collaborate with the architect doing incredible work at looking at the inside of the work. And we learned a lot from John's ideas also about the outside. But you can see here where we looked at empty space between buildings and how that might be regenerated conceptually in ways that accommodated uses, including parking, which is always a challenge. On the next slide, you'll see that we drew from this work and all of the community participation, and of course the great ideas of and knowledge and reports from all the professionals involved, some ideas about what were the priorities going forward. So there's so much you want to do. There's so many design goals you want to see. How do you think about those? And we certainly thought about the importance of really establishing a vocabulary for the site in terms of color and materials. And the primary goal of activating the exterior space around the building is to make an interesting place, and the role of art in that. On the next slide, you'll see that that prioritization was important, and what is more important than that prioritization is the fact that NeighborWorks has been working on those priorities, which we'll see as we come up. And I'm going to show in the next slide that patio space. So remember, we saw all the dots where when events were held, that patio space was activated. Interesting, people liked being there, although they had some issues about that. One is they felt too exposed to the roadway. They didn't feel a sense of security in the area. There was worry about a possible accident and traffic coming up onto the space. And then there was also the problem that when the space was not being used, it didn't present a visual to the community that people found attractive and a good gateway to things that might be happening in other parts of the site. So bear in mind, remember this before. And on the next slide, you'll see some of the conceptual work towards, well, what's after. And you'll see in this view, a primary part of that after is the identification of this bread oven as part of the way that the space is populated. It addresses a sloping site in this area, a fixed amenity that can be used, but also by locating it here, freed up the upper patio up the stairs for broader, more flexible programming. And we looked at the lights you can see above and artwork you'll see going forward as enclosing that patio area and salvage stone as part of the way to protect it from traffic. On the next slide, you'll see that we went from that concept in the drawing before to the implementation. You'll see the opening of the bread oven here and the accomplishment of this amenity that starts to activate this space. In the next slide, you'll see that it is active, being used. We're great to see Marty Pearson in the apron there, who not only helped us understand bread ovens, but was the primary builder of the oven, and also has been the primary trainer of all the people who've learned to and use this oven, both for events, but also for an amenity for the entrepreneurial kitchen that's associated with it, for vocational training from the high school, and also for demonstrations from the museum. On the next slide, you'll see other views of the fun of this more activated, more detailed space. And in the next slide, you'll see that this even has moved to the current. So we did some resilience planning as part of this process and looked at a lot of issues. I remember at the time pandemic was on the list, but wasn't necessarily at the top of our list, but was thought about and has been part of the incredible opportunity to have outdoor programmable space. On the next slide, you'll see that also the upper patio space with the lighting surrounded by artwork by Ross Miller, and his firm encloses the space without cutting it off from the main street. So this kind of permeable area really has facilitated both the programming that we learned about through the tests and the planning process, and input from both the performers and attendees to those programs. Finally, on the next slide, you'll see that the quality of this artwork and the amenity also adds a little bit of excitement to the space, even when it's not able to be used, which obviously is going to be a lot of the time. And my contact information is on the next slide if I can answer any questions for anybody attending the program. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy. I don't see any questions. Sean, do you see any questions for our panelists?
Yes, actually,
Okay.
I have one in from Catherine Fierick, and I'm assuming it's to Kathy. It's what kind of financing package was used here? What tax credits, incentives were required to make the project work?
You're on mute, Kathy.
Yeah, to start with, I'm of course not the expert on the financing of the program. What I'll say is everything. And so one of the real pleasures of working with NeighborWorks is that Joe Garlick and his team and Megan really write every grant that comes along. They have, I think, the opportunity of a big vision to see where pieces come together. And so the primary funding for a lot of the interiors of the mill buildings will be low-income housing tax credits. They did use brownfield remediation money to be able to from EPA to make the site safe. They have reached out to Levitt to do programming. They've worked with a variety of art programs. LISC has provided some funding for placemaking and early work around that. They really have put together all of the resources, and I really suggest that if Joe Garlick, you talk to him sometime because and maybe because he is just a genius at this, and Meg, who works with him.
I just want to mention that obviously funding is an extremely important part of mill redevelopment. Our third webinar in the series is going to be focused on funding. So, please come back for that if you're interested in funding. Sean, do you have any other questions?
Sure. Catherine has another question. What was the impact on surrounding land uses, any subsequent investments?
So that's a really good question. I think that the overall vision is, in addition to being able to inform grant writing, also informed other kinds of investment. The entrepreneurial kitchen that is part of this program and proximate to this patio has brought a lot of folks in to start businesses, and that was identified early in the assets of the community, that so many people were great cooks and bakers and able to start businesses and the start there. So those businesses have started there. They are part of the programming and the events that are there, but also the availability of their catering services and others has helped to activate some of the other businesses. Programming here, complements the Main Street. The amazing group of merchants on Main Street have really collaborated here, and so they've not only been able to fill a few storefronts, but also to expand the kind of businesses that are there and the programming that they have. So an evening event may bring people for a drink later down the street. There may be an opportunity because of the Christmas stroll that connects down to the Millrace district for people to pass businesses that might be able to carry another product that they might not have been able to do. So there's a lot of incremental development in the community that I think is tied to this, and also that this program, that the work at the Millrace district has really benefited from the creativity of the other merchants in the area, as well as the ideas from all of the participants in the planning.
Okay. Do we have another question?
Yes, we actually have two more. Nathan McClung asks, how do you meet NFIP standards when the project is located in the SFHA? I have no idea what those acronyms stand for. And even if the structure is registered as historical.
I don't know what all those letters stand for. Clearly, all of the buildings need to go through the regulatory processes required for historic preservation. Each of the building rehabs is, clearly informed by that, and the work has carefully protected the historic elements of the buildings, and the interpretation understands and builds on that. But if there's a more specific question, I can.
Yeah, we actually sent in a clarification. It's a special flood hazard area. Floodplain.
So brilliant. Yeah. That this is a concern. Flooding is a concern. When we did the resiliency planning, we looked at that. And so you'll see that this patio is, well, you might not be able to see from what I presented, is at an upper area and is outside of the flood hazard area. And so, but as the lower part of the site is programmed, flood hazard planning is a big part of that planning. And so residential units will not be on the ground level. And exit paths and mechanical systems and everything are being planned to be out of the hazard areas, and planning for the first floor uses at that lower level will be programmed as commercial uses that are resilient and with systems elevated above, so that expected worst case flooding won't impact those systems. Does that answer the question?
I think you do.
And let me just interject that that's a great question. And I invite you to the next webinar where we're going to have historic preservation specialists. We're going to be talking about flooding issues, and that would be a great question for our panelists at our next webinar. So I hope you will ask that again. Sean, any other questions?
We have one last question, and this is from Storm Cunningham. These are all great projects. Are there any communities that stand out from a standpoint of having an ongoing revitalization program for their mill project? To fit, it was a program to fit their mill project into. So let me read that again. These are all great projects. Are there any communities that stand out from a standpoint of having an ongoing revitalization program to fit their mill project into?
Kathy, I can't think of a particular place that has done multiple. I think such big projects that when people survive them, they probably want to take a bit of a break. But following up on a previous question about, with the preservation regulation, not all of these potential projects, existing mills, are going to exist in a local historic district, probably unless it's closer to a city, such as Providence and all the mills we have in Olneyville. But certainly get in touch with your state historic preservation office, because they've done these. There are just so many of them, and so even in tiny Rhode Island, there are so many. And I think that's a great place to start. You're probably going to want to be heading in the direction of state and federal tax credits anyway. And so getting in touch with the SHPO, I'm sure that they can provide some do's and don'ts to get you started in thinking about programming and design.
Yeah, I mean, one place I would just direct is to North Adams, Massachusetts. I mean, North Adams has done an incredible job, both with the development of Mass MoCA, which is now a collection of buildings as a museum, but then they've connected to rehabilitation of surrounding buildings for other uses. And so there really is a comprehensive look at that community, including the mill buildings, but not limited to the mill buildings. And what a wonderful trip. So I would suggest that those able to be done, I think, safely distanced. So I would recommend that as a great model. Pittsburgh has done some great planning along its waterfront and the mill buildings that is definitely worth looking at, and their community design center has been active in that. But there is so much great work done by so many people.
Okay, I think.
We actually have one more if you want.
Okay, sure.
Actually, somebody followed up to that question and said that they felt that Lowell, Mass may be a good example.
Yep.
And we have one also North Adams, Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts. So, and the last question is, do you think that the high ceilings in mills may make them especially good for adaptive reuse after COVID-19, when fresh air input is more important to work conditions?
Well, I'll chime in and say that I think this is one great example of how this 21st century pandemic gets us back to living and breathing fresh air and having operable windows, and the windows for light and for ventilation were so important for the mills, particularly the early 19th century ones, that when they very commonly are turned into residences, and I think there's a pretty standard, no matter where you go, loft residents within these mills, having operable windows and huge amount of glazing is certainly important and a nice benefit if it's built into the rehab. And I visit Lowell, Massachusetts. I went a couple of years ago. They have, I don't know what percentage of the machinery runs, but just to get an idea of how noisy the places were, it's a great hands-on history visit.
Great. So thank you all for your questions. Sean, if you go to the next slide. I just want to thank our wonderful speakers. Thank you to Dennis, Rachel, and Kathy. Thanks so much to EPA Region 1 for supporting this series. The next webinar in our Roadmap to Mill Redevelopment series will focus on the challenges and solutions to redevelopment. We will be discussing historic preservation, contamination, structural and infrastructure issues, and impacts due to our changing climate. We will be getting into the nuts and bolts of mill redevelopment and also featuring more of New England's mills that have been repurposed. This webinar will be held on October 6th at 10 a.m. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.